Now, there are other famous versions of dialectical methods, which may or may not be directly connected to the Enlightenment method of Hegel and his contemporaries. For example, Karl Marx's historical materialism was closely related to Hegel's dialectical methods. In fact, Marx identified as a Hegelian, as a disciple, an intellectual descendant of his ideas. Marx offered a step toward a communist utopia that synthesized pre-Enlightenment values. For example, in the sphere of economics, the thesis of capitalism synthesized with the antithesis of socialism, and produced the synthesis that he called communism.
And there were other sorts of post-Hegelian Enlightenment theories about knowledge and development. One famous Enlightenment dialectic was from the theistic side, in the thought of Søren Kierkegaard's moral philosophy. He considered a person cycling dialectically through three different stages, as that person would grow toward maturity. The aesthetic, moral, and the religious nature of a person would cycle from one stage to another, and develop, and grow, and mature. In Reformed theology, in the early part of the 20th century, theologians built upon some of the concepts from Kierkegaard, including Karl Barth and Emil Brunner, for example, as well as some others, and so they wanted to come up with a process that was built largely on a dialectical mode that Kierkegaard had pioneered, and so their new, or neo-orthodoxy, was sometimes called dialectical theology.
So we get to the issue: is the dialectic a good thing? Should we embrace it in our theology? More specifically, we mean, for example, should people who are reformed, in the sense that Herman Bavinck represents, be for, or against, the use of it? Of course, it's hard to be against growth and development, and in this broad sense, who would want to oppose a dialectical method? And indeed, you can think of Bavinck's theology, including this idea of organic progression, where things develop, a seed sprouts, and becomes a small plant, and the small plant grows, and then it eventually comes to its full fruition, and produces its fruit. So again, one has the idea about iterating, on an upward spiral of maturity. And so, in the Reformed sense, we would be talking about a dialectic that covered the traditional values of the past, and yet discovered knowledge in fresh, new and vibrant ways.
So, I can think right off of the top of my head, for one example of a positive form of dialectic, as far as Christian theology goes, and this would be what some have called an inductive approach to Bible study. Anyone can use an inductive method by following three simple steps: observation, interpretation, and application. For example, if we were to do an inductive Bible study using Psalm 131, which was read earlier to open up this session, the first step that is to go through Psalm 131, all of the verses in it, and journal and observe the facts, themes, and narrative content that the text presents. One great way to do is to make a game of it. Can you write 10 different factual statements which the text is affirming? And once you've done that, you've observed what the text is actually trying to say, in a way that is faithful to it as a literary work.
Then you start a process of interpretation. Okay, I have observed the facts now, what do these facts mean? And that's really where theology gets interesting, right? And we've got a lot of issues to cover, as to why different people can look at the same facts of Scripture, and yet come to different interpretations about the meaning. So that's a deep subject, probably needs its own episode, I think, to really flesh out and do justice, and that's really where the field of hermeneutics comes into its own and shines. And finally, there's the application, so there's the synthesis of the data, and what the data means, and so in this third step, you seek to apply the data, as well as what it means, to your life. So this is an example of what I would say would be a positive productive dialectical form that is very reputable in Christian theology.
And so, there's an interesting thing to talk about here, and that is this idea of maturity laid out, or described, as a spiral, and so as you go back, and revisit the Scriptures, over the years. Consider the first time you have read the text, versus the 10th time. The text is the same text, as it was the first time, But now it is, let's say, 10 years later, and you are reading the text for the 10th time. However, while the text is the same, it's very likely that you are not, and so what has happened? This process of growth can be illustrated with the spiral. Maturity increases as the spiral unfolds, as the spiral projects outward, and goes onward, and ever upward, and if you look at a spiral in 3 dimensions, you can imagine that spiral growing higher, and going more, and more outward.
Many people have approached dialectical methods as these hermeneutical spirals. Now there is a very important thing to note: this step in the spiral is a narrative step. The thesis, antithesis, and synthesis is not a change in the truths that the Bible is trying to teach. In other words, it's not a change in the content of the revelation, it's a change in readers' understanding of it. And so, this maturity is used to bring resolution to apparent tensions in narratives. So, as you mature in the scriptures, things that were maybe perhaps not so clear to you the first time you read through them, over time become more clear, as you become more expert, and more studied, and more familiar with them.
I remember the first few years, and the first few times I had read through the scriptures. I had many answers, and I had more than enough knowledge to satisfy me. However, I still had questions in my understanding. Okay, I would think, I see that the text says something, but what does that mean? How should I interpret, or think about this text? Then finally, what does it mean for my life? But the questions were not inadequacies in the biblical text, but in my understanding of them, which is a key distinction. And so now here I am, 40 years later, after perhaps 10 full read-throughs of the scriptures, during those years.
And I can tell you now, that it is the same text that I first read 40 years ago, but I am not the same person, and as I've read the texts, they have informed me, they have grounded me, and they have matured me. They've helped me develop, they have spurred, and stimulated me into new, and better understandings. So this is a positive example of dialectic. Now, let's move forward.
Using the literary theme, the idea of narrative, or story progress in a storyline, and let's take a look at that portrait of Charles Dickens, and note there is a very classic sort of dialectic unfolding that Dickens employs in his famous work, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, he opens, and then the rest of the novel explains what exactly he meant by that. In other words, the rest of the novel unfolds the drama that fulfills the promise of the opening lines.
Let me read them, in a little bit more detail. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, and we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way.
What does this mean? Well, if one takes a view of the truths of theology, as solely being propositional, as solely being a database of true and false statements, then this looks contradictory and nonsensical. How could something be the best of times, and the worst of times, at the same time, and in the same sense? Wouldn't that violate the law of contradiction? Aren't we abusing logic to speak in such a way? If Dickens was arguing solely propositional truths, if he's solely constructing a database of true and false terms, then he's clearly articulating something irrational with his text above.
It couldn't possibly be both, in the same sense, and yet, Dickens is not arguing propositionally, but is instead laying out literary themes that he will then unfold and unpack dialectically, and explain throughout the rest of the novel. Then this is good writing, in the sense of constructing a narrative theme. In Dickens's era, what he describes we will see, the best of times, represented in the noblest of human actions, and the worst of times, in the most ignoble, And in the most evil of human actions, we will see people acting wisely, and we will see people acting foolishly. Sometimes the same person may be foolish in one stage, and then later is wise, and so on, and so forth, with the other dialectical pairs here.
And so this is a very positive example of a literary device. Once again, let me emphasize that this is not arguing propositionally. This is not seeking to change the truth value of the objective and underlying nature of reality. This is a literary device, used to describe the knowledge in a person, as that person progresses and matures. But having said that, does this passage remind you of any passages in the scripture that maybe takes a similar approach? Well, it absolutely reminded me of a particular passage.